Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I'd like to thank Julianne for that generous introduction. I'd like to thank Dean Rutherford for the opportunity to address you. I think the Clinton School for Public Service lecture series is one of the things that's a highlight in my life when I come here as a member of the audience many times over the last several years. So it's a real honor for me to be on this side of the podium. I'm also honored. I see a lot of new faces, but I see a bunch of old friends and colleagues from UAMS. I'm so thankful that you're here. And I'm particularly pleased that my family's here, my wife Rebecca and my daughters Karina and Layla. Thank you for all coming. We may need a little, can everybody see that? Well, let's see what we got here. I'm supposed to be giving a talk right now. All right, I think we're good. I study addiction, as you already have heard. And through its scientific study, I've come to understand the conditions that lets addicts or results in addicts making poor decisions, decisions that hurt them. And what I'm learning is this aspect of why they make these decisions that are not good for them, we sometimes share, many of us share with them. And if we understood that, we may come to understand a lot of the foibles that humans have, a lot of the challenging behaviors that we exhibit, why we do. And that's what I'd like to explore here today. So what I'd like to do is provide an understanding of addiction and also other challenging behaviors using what I call the translational approach. We're going to have to borrow from a lot of different sciences to get this thing done. Anthropology, economics, neuroscience, psychology, and sociology. And I'll be touching on all of them. I want to examine how this integrative approach provides insights into the effects to alter those challenging behaviors, how they produce them and how they alter them. All right. So this was the data Julianne was talking about. I asked a bunch of heroin addicts and a group of controls to tell me the back end of a story. And the story went, when I think about the future, I think. And the controls who were matched on IQ, gender, socioeconomic status, with the heroin addicts referred to a future of 4.7 years. Heroin addicts referred to a future of 9 days. Or said another way, the controls referred to a future of 1,715 days, and the heroin addicts referred to a future of 9. That's a big old difference and provides an important context to understand why addicts do the things they do. If I can only think about the next 9 days, should I be worried about sharing a needle that someone else has just injected drugs into their vein with? I don't think so, because any consequence of that will extend beyond those 9 days. We can think about the other challenging behaviors that addicts exhibit, be it stealing, or other interpersonal challenges that they exhibit, and understand it in the same context. But more importantly, and what I'm trying to make the argument for you today, is there's a range of other behaviors that also exhibit this, maybe not to the same degree, but to the extent they do, you're going to run into problems. To the extent that you think about any particular aspect of your life, in the short term and not the long term, you may run into problems. And that's going to be my argument. If it is the case that this is an important part of decision-making generally, there should be some evidence that people have recognized this in history. And there are a lot of examples of that. I'm just going to provide one. This is by the economist Bob Baywork, 1889. He says, "It occurs frequently, I believe, that a person is faced with a choice between a present and future satisfaction or dissatisfaction, and that he decides in favor of lesser present pleasure even though he knows perfectly well and is even explicitly aware at the moment he makes his choice that the future disadvantage is the greater, and that therefore his well-being on the whole suffers by reason of his choice. How often does each of us give in to weakness and allow himself to be swept along into acquiescence or action, which he knows immediately he's going to regret on the morrow?" That is what I'm starting to talk about. I'm talking about people who knowingly make decisions that they think will come to haunt them, and they do. That is what I call the tyranny of small decision. What I'm saying here is it refers to situations where an individual can be victimized by the narrowness of the temporal context in which he or she exercises choice. If you only think shortly about the future, you don't consider the long-term consequences of your actions, there's going to be problems. Now, that's not universally true. There are certain times when you have to think about the short term. If someone was coming after me with a knife, it'd be good if I could focus in the next couple of minutes. But if you do that routinely, if you do that either pervasively or routinely in certain aspects of your life, you may also run into trouble. What I'd like to make the case is that the tyranny of small decision has certain characteristics. The choices that are associated with it favor the immediately valued choice and ignore the long-term consequences. And I think examples of this tyranny of small decisions include addiction, risky sexual behavior that could spread HIV infection, debt and the failure to save money, very relevant to so many of us these days. I believe that it's also relevant to understanding global climate change, many forms of crime, and obesity. And I think could help us really do a lot to improve the world if we understand it a little bit better. This is the presidential address from Holdren that he presented at the American Association for the Advancement of Science that was published in Science magazine. And here are the lists, according to the World Health Organization, of the major causes of mortality in the world. And I'm going to make the case that the ones that I've highlighted here are examples of the tyranny of small decision. Essentially, obesity, high blood pressure, all the consequences, diabetes that result from overeating, unsafe sex, tobacco, alcohol consumption, global climate change, where we think about, oh, I'd rather drive my car today than take public transportation. Well, if that's true, then this notion can address 350 million years of life lost, or 54% of the millions of years of life lost on this list. So I think we're talking about big things here. But we have to understand them, we have to understand what's behind them. Not the symptoms, but what's the processes that guide this tyranny of small decisions. And that's the point of this silly cartoon. A person who carries extra weight, the size of a large household appliance on their back, says, "Doc, my knees are killing me." The doc says, "Well, let's get an MRI and see what the trouble is." Well, the obesity is the symptom, is the process behind the symptom of the knees hurting. What I want to know is what is the process behind the obesity? What is the process behind addiction? What is the process behind failure to save? And if they're the same, then we can make a lot of progress by recognizing that similarity and addressing them in concert. So let's explore this whole notion and the processes behind the symptoms by exploring the tyranny of small decisions in 4 dimensions. And I like to use the approach that Nicholas Tinbergen did in his 1951 paper. Nicholas Tinbergen is the Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine in 1973, and he said to understand any behavior, you have to understand it in 4 dimensions. You have to understand the mechanism, and by that I'm interpreting it to mean relevant brain regions and structures that contribute to the behavior. The development, how does this behavior change and the process associated with change throughout the life course? Evolution, what's the evolutionary basis of this behavior? And function, how does this behavior adapt to the current environment? And there I'm going to be talking a great deal about our culture, because I think our culture can have a great impact on the extent to which we consider the future. So let's start with the first dimension. Well, there's this new hypothesis that has a highfalutin name. It's called the Competing Neurobehavioral Decision Systems Hypothesis. But what it's really saying is there are 2 parts of our brain that contribute mightily to our decisions to do one thing versus the other. One is an evolutionary old part of the system, which I will call the impulsive system. That's associated with the midbrain. It's the limbic system, ventral striatum. It's the part that says, I'm hungry, I want to eat now. I'm thirsty, I want to drink now. It's about survival. I want to survive now, so I better get these things that I need, and I better get them right now. The other part is what I call the executive system. It's putatively the seat of rationality and valuation. It's the part where there's someone's plans for the future, anticipates the future, tries to figure out how to get from here to this temporally distant event. And it's associated primarily with the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, the evolutionary newest part. Here's a cartoon from an article by Bickel that illustrates this. The bluish or purple colored parts are supposed to be the executive system because they're cool and irrational, and the red parts are supposed to be the impulsive system because they're hot and make decisions that are not often very thoughtful. What was very helpful in this is Sam McClure in a Science 2004 paper, and I'm very proud to say that I'm collaborating with Sam McClure at this time, did a study and examined when people made decisions about the future versus decisions about the present. And when they made decisions about the present, aspects of that impulsive system that I talked to you about lit up when he imaged their brains. And when they made decisions about the future, the aspects of the prefrontal cortex lit up. That's when they thought about the long-term consequences of their decisions. And just to do a little bit of bragging, at UAMS we have some of these magnetic resonance imaging machines, and we're actually doing research right now to examine these decision-making processes in the addicted and in others, and we can replicate the type of work that Sam has found, and we're trying to extend it. So we know what brain parts are involved. Let's think about how this relates to development, our second dimension. This is a very fascinating study by Gallivan in the Journal of Neuroscience, and he looked at essentially evaluation tests. How do you value a certain amount of money? And he had he measured the lighting up of the brain from the impulsive part of the brain and from the executive system of the brain in children, adolescents, and adults. Now remember, what I'm talking about is these two brain systems are fighting to make the decision. Which one has greater activity is generally going to rule the day. And you can see here, I want to draw your attention to the adolescents. Look, the impulsive system's way high, thinking about the future, way low. That may suggest they're going to have greater risk. You can see the adults, there's greater proportionality between those two systems. The children, they specify as related to non-specific issues and how the brain is changing. And I'm not an expert in kids' brains, so I'm just going to accept what they say. But if we think about it then, and we look at the time course of these systems coming on and being activated, we come up with this sort of graph here. So we're looking at functional development. The red is the limbic region. This line here is the prefrontal cortex, the executive system, limbic system, executive system. Here's adolescence, right? The shaded part is when the limbic system's running the day. And that's where adolescence is. So if that's true, we should see some evidence of this sort of developmental time course. Well, there's this one way that I look at how people think about the future, and it's actually how they discount the future. I'm not going to describe that in detail because it's very technical, but it's essentially how much do they discount the future? They discount it little, which means they think about the future a lot, or do they discount it a lot, which means they pretty much just think about now? And we can measure this in a very similar way in many different individuals, and if I take all the data that's available, both our data and that which has been published previously, we see a developmental pattern. Here we have, so the greater the discounting, the more they're just focused on the now. And if we take a cross-section of individuals, you can see that the older you are, the less you discount the future. That sort of makes sense, maybe. But if this is true, then I should see evidence of it in behavior, in risky behavior, right? If in adolescence you're being driven by your limbic system, I should see some evidence that you're engaged in risky behavior. Well, let's take a look at some of that. Here is data from the National Household Survey, which is a self-reported drug use that's conducted through a national sample. It's done frequently, and it's been done for over 30 years, and we've been analyzing it, and here we have age participation graphs. We're asking how many people of different ages can say affirmatively they used illicit drugs in the last month in this cross-section. It doesn't matter what year I have here because all the years look the same. And what I want to bring to your attention is that although there are quantitative differences, we see the same general shape of the function. That is, illicit drug use starts in the early teens, has a peak sometime around age 20, and then declines over time. That's true for illicit drug use in general, marijuana use, cocaine use, heavy alcohol use, binge alcohol use, and cigarette use. It's the same phenomena. But hold up, wait a second. If this is really risky behavior, it shouldn't just be evident with drugs. Shouldn't we see it in other forms of risky behavior? Well, you gotta love England and Wales. Here's data of the age participation graphs again. For England and Wales, 1842 to 1844, those people that were arrested for crime. And the United States, 1990. I see the same shape function. But now it's separated between males and females, and we know males may exhibit a little bit less of that prefrontal cortex coming online. But you see that same shape function. And even with females, you see some evidence of that same function as well. Well, wait a second. What about even riskier behavior? Here's data on homicides. The first thing I got to point to is we're looking at homicides for the entire country of Canada and the city of Chicago. Note the peak. 55 for Canada, around 800 for the city of Chicago. We'll talk about this when we talk about the role of culture. But what we see, nonetheless, is that same shape function. Maybe shift a little bit later, but I guess if you're going to get guns and stuff, you have to have a few more resources, so you may be a little bit older before you can get a hold of it. But we see the same profile of risk. So what I'm suggesting is that risk is a biologically normal event among adolescents. It's what they do. Now, you may be able to, through various efforts, suppress it a little bit or move it around, but you're not going to change it, because that's the way we're built. What we have to start thinking about is ways to put it in more socially appropriate risky behavior, as opposed to the risky behavior that we'd prefer people not engage in. Let's move on to the third dimension, the evolutionary basis for the tyranny of small decision. Darwin said, on the ordinary view of each species having been independently created, we gain no scientific explanation. He suggests we should look for commonalities. And if we do that, we can often see commonalities, even though there are huge quantitative variations. That's the biological concept of homology. Here we have the forearm from 4 different species, and this is the humerus from humans, and we can tell that even though the cat's humerus looks very different, that they're fairly similar. And we can also find the similarities with the whale humerus, which is quantitatively different but serves the same general function, and with a bat who has a wing. So by doing this, we can start tracking that the humerus must have a long evolutionary history that's shared by all these different species. Well, I think we can do the same thing in biology of behavior. Here is that measure I was talking about, how people and other organisms discount the future. I got pigeons, rats, and humans, and this is how much they discount the future when they go from now to the future, now to the future, now to the future. And you can see the same shaped function. I'm going to argue that those are the same processes involved. Now, it makes sense evolutionary that you should discount the future. The old adage, 1 in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, makes a lot of sense, right? If you're looking for survival, you better eat what you got and not worry about what you don't have. I'll take it now. Thank you very much. So that makes perfect sense. But the one thing we have to come to grips with is the pigeons and rats are discounting over seconds. Humans here are discounting over months and years. Why is that the case? And does it tell us something very important about ourselves? Well, so why do humans have a longer temporal horizon? Charles Darwin said, "A moral being is one who is capable of reflecting on his past actions and their motives, of approving some and disapproving others." Being able to look back at one's own behavior, make decisions about whether it was a good idea or not, so that you can then make changes for the future, is a hallmark of our species, and something that we don't share that much with the other species I looked at. Why is that the case? Why did that develop? Well, there was this really innovative researcher, Dunbar, who said he wanted to understand why we have the prefrontal cortex, because that's where we think about the future. Why do we have such a big one? And he looked at every possible thing that could be correlated with the prefrontal cortex and compared it in simian species, monkeys, and in hominid species, ourselves and our predecessors, based on inferences on skull casings and what's known about them through archaeology. And he said, okay, is it fruit in the diet that changed? Is it home range? Is it day journey length to get food? Is it type of foraging that's done? And the only thing he could find was measures of sociality that was correlated with how big the prefrontal cortex is. Here he's got group size, but also play and grooming correlate nicely with the size of prefrontal cortices in these different groups of species, including ourselves. What that suggests is that the reason we have this big prefrontal cortex to think about the future is not for survival, not about the contingencies of survival, but the contingencies of community. We have a big brain like this because we're a social group. And because we're a social group, it's good to be able to think about the future and the past a little bit. If I approach the alpha male and I get hit, some other member of my troop may say, I don't think I'm going to approach the alpha male right now. I'll wait. Well, that's about deferring the immediate decision to later. That's where you start to have to think about the future. So I think that is the basis. Now, let's think again. If we have individuals who discount the future, what does that mean? It may mean that they're not going to be as good in social contexts. Here's some data from my laboratory with my colleagues, Richard Yee, where we looked at how much a bunch of addicts, actually, heroin addicts, discount the future and how much they cooperated in a prisoner's dilemma task. Right? And a prisoner's dilemma task is essentially a game where you can either cooperate or defect upon the player you're playing with. And we found that the more that they discount the future, the more they are defecting on their partner. I think this makes perfect sense. If you're not using your prefrontal cortex, you're not thinking about the future, then you're not going to be concerned about the consequences of defecting, of not cooperating with your neighbors or friends. And any of you that know individuals at the extreme with addiction, you know that that's not unusual. So now we get to move into the fourth dimension. This is where I'm going to try to wax eloquent about the role of culture. But I hope to not just convince you by logic, but also by some data. I'd like to argue that cultural practices can influence how much we think about the future. Now, I could make an argument based on logic that, well, just look at humans, for example. We've been around for about 500,000 years. Until the last 2.6% of our time, we were hunter-gatherers. And hunting-gathering is a lifestyle, an economic lifestyle that doesn't require a lot of consideration of the future. You exploit a patch of potential food until it's fully exploited, then you move on to the next patch. 2.6% of our time on Earth, years in time ago, we developed agriculture. That really requires that we think about the future, right? I'm planting seeds today I'm going to water them and take care of them, so months from now, I can have some food. Well, I could make that, and you could say, well, that's a just so story. Can't you have any more data than that? And then you got to say, well, I love science because someone's actually answered that question. This is an anthropologist, Tucker, who studied natives of Madagascar. And the natives of Madagascar, one group of them adopted farming not too long ago, and the other group are still hunter-gatherers, exploiting one patch to the other. And he measured how much they think about the future. That's great, right? So, or discount the future. And the hunter-gatherers discount the future more than the farmers, substantially more than the farmers. The farmers are thinking about the future. That's an economic necessity for their lifestyle, so they don't discount that much. Those that engage in a hunter-gathering lifestyle, their economic lifestyle doesn't require they consider the future, and they don't. How one lives in one's culture, the demands placed on it by one's culture determines to the extent you think about the future. Now, I think that's a real truism. And to explore that further, I'd like to go to some factors that I think that are operating in our culture that are promoting a short temporal horizon. They include poverty and the culture of immediate gratification. Oscar Lewis is a very important sociologist. He said about poverty, the culture of poverty is not just a matter of deprivation or disorganization, a term signifying the absence of something. It is a culture in the traditional anthropological sense in that it provides human beings with a design for living, with a ready-made set of solutions for human problems, and so serves a significant adaptive function. Wherever it occurs, its practitioners exhibit remarkable similarity in the structures of their families, in interpersonal relations, in spending habits, in their value systems, and in their orientation in time. Well, we know, based on a lot of information, that if we measure time preference, which is an economic concept that talks about how much you discount the future, that it's correlated, or it's negatively correlated with labor income or educational attainment. That is, the poorer you are, the less education you have, the more you discount the future. And in fact, I can show that remarkably even in participants that come to my research laboratory. If a participant comes to my research laboratory to participate in not a treatment study, but just participate in a laboratory study, they're generally not doing very well financially. And in fact, the mean income for people that come to these type of studies is about $1,000 a month. So it's not very much. Well, if I take that group and I split them into two halves, lower SES and higher SES, and I look at how much they consider the future, the higher SES considers a longer future than the ones with the lower income, rather high. But here we're talking about a small difference in income between these two groups, but we can still see that difference as we move to lower and lower. Once again, the economic consequences of the environment you live in puts different demands on your brain systems, and that changes how you think about time. If you follow this argument, I think there's a great opportunity in pursuing this to try to solve one of the big problems, I think, in our country and also here in Arkansas, and that's health disparities. We know that the poorer you are, be it as measured by educational attainment or whether it's from how much money you make, that the poorer you are, the less education you have, the more mortality and morbidity of all diseases you're going to have. Even worse, of course, it's the poor person who doesn't have good dental care, who also may drink excessively and smoke and not eat right and not exercise and not buckle their seatbelt. We're not talking about 6 or 7 disorders. We're talking about one person who has a certain style of living, and it expresses itself in a diverse set of ways. Unfortunately, I think too much We cut the universe up into say, well, what's the unique etiology of smoking? What's the unique processes that result in people being obese? I think we're missing the big picture because I think all those people are the same. They're all exhibiting it. Why? I think that's the tyranny of small decisions. There was a very interesting study that was done by Peter Hall recently. He took just a community sample, right, independent of who they are, and he measured how well their executive function was working and the extent to which they engaged in health-risky and health-protective behaviors. And he found a strong correlation. You have a working executive function, you engage in more health-protective behaviors. If you don't have a good executive function working, you engage in more risky behaviors. What does that mean? That means that if you don't have a good executive system, what's running the show is that impulsive system that I talked about earlier. Well, how could this come to be? How come individuals who are from lower SES categories, why do their kids have to grow up that way? You know, it's just economic circumstances. Well, here's one way it could operate. This is data from Hart and Risley. They went into the homes of low SES, working class families and high SES families who had children, and they went in there from the time they were 1 year old to the time they were 3 years old, and they measured every utterance from parent to child at the times they went there to sample. And on the basis of that, this is the data they collected. So by the time a child is, and these are cumulative number of utterances, so by 3 years, there is a 25 million utterance difference between low SES and high SES families. What if we wanted to fix that? That would be a daunting task. If we just wanted to take the low SES and get them to the working class, we're still talking about, you know, something on the order of 10, 15 million word utterance differences. Already at year 3 of life, these kids are facing great challenges. I think we have to open our eyes to understand that the initial places where people are born and the circumstances require our attention. And this can be transmitted. Here's a fascinating study by a colleague of mine who measures here, once again, how much they discount the future. The higher the curve, the more they discount the future. In a mother and a child, now the mother here is a smoker, and these mothers are not smokers, and this is the child of the smoker, and these are the childs of the non-smoker. I don't think this is passive smoke infusion. I think that in the family of the smoker, they discount the future a lot more, and they exhibit it in all the choices they make, and their children adopt that style, and they discount the future more. That's how we get the intergenerational transfer of temporal view, which may undergird intergenerational transfer of poverty. Let's go to the other extreme, the culture of immediate gratification. Mina Miller Edison, Thomas's wife, said, "I sometimes think that the present-day descendants of those who conquered the wilderness are being conquered by a wilderness of leisure. Our constant cry is to make things easy." Well, you don't have to look too far to understand some of the dramatic changes that have come with making things easy. Let's just think about television, not so much as a singular cause, but as emblematic of a whole series of changes in our society that occurred over a short period of time. In the 1950s, I think television was invented like 1948. In 1950, it was in 10% of homes. In 1959, it was in 90% of homes. That's one of our best technological diffusions we've ever had. What does television teach us? It teaches us that any life problem can be solved in 30 minutes or less. And through the advertising, it tells us all the things we need to be happy. Well, what we know is that high school graduates spend 1,500 hours engaged in electric media versus 12,000 hours in high school. Wow. Each generation is spending 5 to 8% more time in electronic entertainment. There's this interesting Canadian experiment. Because of where they were located, they weren't able to get reception for television until they finally imported in cable. And they acquired TV in 1973. 2 years later, Rates of physical aggression among children increased 160%. There was reduced participation in social activities. Reading skills developed slower, and measures of creativity showed decreases. What we're learning, I think, is that television and other electronic media has an opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost is our ability to interact effectively with each other. Instead of sitting on the front porch and talking with our neighbor, we're watching the tube or we're checking the internet, and that has consequences. And I think it shortens our temporal view. There are plenty of examples of advertising where they say, why do it the hard way? Do it the easy way. Do this. And the message is about spending and don't worry about debt. Even in this adverse economic climate, I'm still getting credit card offers like crazy through the mail. Well, that's going to just reinforce a short temporal view. Texting. I'm not of the texting generation, but there are a lot of children who do that. And there's actually evidence to suggest it's impacting their ability to think in sentences. What kind of consequences is that going to have? So if this is true, if we have a culture of immediate gratification, I should be able to show you some evidence. Let's consider our world today. The author James Baldwin said, people pay for what they do and still more for what they've allowed themselves to become, and they pay for it simply by the lives they lead. This is a study from Archives Journal of Psychiatry. It looked at the cumulative probability of becoming dependent on a drug if you ever used it at least once. So what it's trying to do is over time, there may have been different availability of drug, but if you at least got it once, that's kind of a control condition. If you got it once, then what's the probability you went on to use more? People that were born 1936 to 45, 46 to 55, television comes in here, 56 to 65, 66 to 75. The later you were born in the last century, the more likely you are to be a drug dependent. Interesting. Obesity. Once again, we're looking at 16 to 11 years old, 12 to 19-year-olds who what portion of them meet the definition of obesity or being overweight as a function of different birth cohorts. There is approximately a threefold increase from the earliest time measured in the 60s to the most recent data that I was able to get a hold of in 2002. We're becoming dramatically more obese. Household savings, around the same time frames, 7%, 8%, and then look. We're negative savings at this time. What I want you, as you go through these slides, should we think that each of these have their own unique cause? Or should we think that maybe there's a cause that stands behind them all? National debt. 1960 to the present. And I'm not a global climate scientist, and I can't tell you whether, definitively whether global warming is a problem or not. But if it is, and it seems to be increasing at a fairly escalating rate during this relevant time frame, it's the same essential problem. Now versus later. Now versus later. Am I going to worry about it now and not worry about the later? Well, that may come to haunt you. So the question that we have to ask is, can we change the future? Can we change our collective future? Can we create a culture that takes the future into account? I've tried to make the argument that our culture can diminish our temporal view. I have to believe that it can increase our temporal view. But that means we've got to make choices. We've got to do different things. How should we approach it? Well, in the most simple way, one too far, I'm telling us that the decision system is essentially a seesaw, right? And if we push down on executive function and we don't have it working very optimally, then we're going to be very impulsive. So what we need to do is we got to push up here and we got to push down there. We got to push up executive function and decrease impulsive activity, constrain it. How might we do that? Well, one way is to raise consciousness. This is a little table that was in an interesting report from a think tank called For a New Thrift. Thrift, what an interesting word. When's the last time you heard it? We don't think about thrift anymore, but we used to have a culture of thrift. And what they did is they said, what are the values behind a lottery versus a savings account? And I'm not here to make an argument about lotteries or not, but I want to explore what the values associated with them are. Lottery, short horizon, savings, long horizon. Lottery, immediate gratification, savings, deferred gratification. Lottery, each new day is a new beginning, right? I might win today, versus accruing benefits slowly over time. Small bets versus small deposits. Cash prizes versus interest. Fun versus fund. Escape debt versus being debt-free. Excitement versus happiness. Windfall versus wealth. Which of these two categories do you think better characterizes our society today? But where do we need to get to? We need to change how we're thinking about these things. And in order to do that, we have to get people to recognize that everybody's trying to convince them this is the quick and easy thing to do, but it's not good for you. We need to reduce poverty. Absolutely, right? And there's ways to do it with early education. Here's a report from the, it's hard for me to pronounce this, Obesity program. I think it's out in North Carolina. They had a control group, an intervention group. These are both highly disadvantaged groups of individuals. These got what they usually get. This is their intervention. What proportion, and the red is the intervention group, what proportion of them needed special education? Well, the control group needed a lot more. Grade repeater, control group got a lot more. Was a high school graduate, the intervention did better. Got to complete 4 years of college, the intervention did better. Non-smoker, right? Did they get involved with drugs? There's another way to think about that. Well, a lot more of the intervention group did not engage in smoking. Ended up with a skilled job or higher education. Once again, the intervention group did better. We need to have early education that works, and we need to have all the kids that are growing up in poverty to have access to it. More than that, we need parent training with incentives for participation. Why do I say incentives for participation? Because parents who are of a low status, who don't have a lot of economic means, can't think about the long-term consequences of not participating. They're just worried about getting food on the table. So we have to help them bridge that temporal gap by giving them something immediate to help them out to solve the problem. We need to facilitate work to a greater extent. You know, the earned income tax credit's a wonderful thing, right? A lot of people make money, or make a near adequate amount of money to survive through that program. But we don't train anybody, and a lot of people need training. So we spend only $3 billion on training versus $42 billion on the earned income tax credit. Now, I don't think we should diminish the earned income tax credit, but I think we got to boost up the training. Because those are the skills, thinking, knowing how to do things that are going to allow people to get out of poverty. And training should not be just limited to technical skills, but also soft skills. There was a study of high school graduates versus those that get their GED degrees, right? And in terms of their intelligence or the ability to do things, are pretty comparable. But the GEDs, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, have a harder time with the soft skills, following directions, showing up to work on time, all the little skills that are necessary to be able to hold a job. So we need to worry about the soft skills as well. I think we need to create and facilitate long-term views, right? You know, the internet's not going away, computers are not going away, but we can shift what we do on them, we can shift our focus on them. For games, we can start playing the games like Civilization, right? Where you take the goal of that, right, is to start with like cave people and have them to our modern day. Well, that's a long view, as opposed to first-person shooters, right, which is a lot of what the market there has. We can change that. We can provide tools for long-term planning. Dan Aurelia, I think his name is, who wrote a wonderful book called Predictably Irrational, argues we should have a self-controlled credit card. We should be able to say to our banks and say, I can't spend more than $20 a month on chocolate. And as soon as I do, my credit card doesn't work for chocolate anymore. Imagine that. That would change everything, right? I don't think the banks would be too interested in that, though. But maybe a savings and loan, local savings and loan would think about it. We need to start advertising the long term and not the short term. Every time I see advertising, it's about solving your problem immediately. Well, we need to be thinking long term. You know what's interesting? The socioeconomic status gradient that we talked about pertains to other interesting things, like decisions to quit smoking. If you are from a low SES group and you want to quit smoking, the reasons you do it is because of immediate health concern or immediate financial concern. If a higher SES person wants to quit smoking, why do they do it? Because of the long-term consequences. It plays itself out over and over again. We need to develop tax and incentive programs to promote the long view. I would argue that a lot of this economic mess that we're in right now is because we set up the incentives of the system so that everybody, all the banks and all the mortgage lenders and sending them around got their chunk of money right up front as they sold it, right? Sold that mortgage to the next person. They got their money. They're not worried about what's going to happen down the line. Well, we're all paying for it now. So to conclude, there may be a common process that underlies multiple challenging behaviors. I think that's the tyranny of small decisions. I think our culture favors the tyranny of small decisions, and I want to begin the conversation of how to escape it. I'm going to finish with a quote by Melges, which I think is exquisite and really summarizes how to think about things. Time is both a medium and a perspective. It is a medium through which we live as the future becomes present. As the future becomes present, we become aware of duration and succession. Also, by transcending the present and looking at it from the past or the future, we gain perspective on the present. These time processes are fundamental to our construction of reality. If they are disturbed, our view of reality may become distorted. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. We've got time for some questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Got some at the back. Let's get the microphone. Hold on just a minute. We're getting the microphones.
Thank you, Dr. Bickel. I was wondering if in your research on addiction, you're finding that the drugs that people are using, in fact, damage the executive part of their brain.
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. So I think there are a lot of multiple processes going on. Certainly some drugs themselves can have toxic effects on the brain, and that's not good, and that can result in it. There's also another thing that I'm trying to actually explore in my research right now, is if you've been an addict for a long period of time, and all you're worried about is feeding your addiction now, you are not using the executive system. You're not thinking about the future. Well, it's going to atrophy just like a muscle you don't use, because the body doesn't maintain structures that aren't used. That's just the way it conserves its own energy. So we just got a grant, and we're just starting that process up at UAMS, where we're looking at whether we can develop executive function therapy for stimulant addicts. Can we train them, and by putting demands on that they use this system, can we actually get improvements in that system, and can it have a big impact on how they make decisions? The other place where I'm really excited and I want to move into, because I think it's obvious to me, right, is we need to have executive function therapy for preschoolers and young kids. I think that should be part of the curriculum, because if they can inhibit their own responding, if they can think about the consequences of their action, we're going to have a group of kids that are going to have less problems when they grow up. And that's why I think some of those early programs do. But it could be that we could do it better if we focus some portion of directly on executive function.
Other questions? There was another hand in the back.
Yes, Dr. Bickel. I've noticed that teenagers seem to engage in risky behavior, such as not wearing a seatbelt or riding a motorcycle without a helmet, because they really feel deep down that they're immortal. Is there an effective way to teach teenagers that they're not immortal? Or should be done before they become teenagers?
Well, you know, I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the thing to think about is, you know, in each of our home lives with kids, are we creating a life that's thinking about the short term or the long term? And one way that I know that you can harness some portion of that, I don't know how successful it is, right, is I know some families who make a contract with their son and daughter about, you know, being able to use the car, you know, and have to meet certain goals that make them think about the long term. There may be a variety of techniques and tools that we could imagine that would be helpful in thinking about the future. You know, if I could just make a little aside, what I'd like to see right now, I think, you know, these type of things, right, don't help us all that much in terms of thinking about the future. But why couldn't there be an app store for health and thinking about planning for the future and thinking about the future? Why couldn't we have a health phone that, if to get your minutes, to allow you to use it, you had to work on a program that was on this phone that made you think a little bit more about the future or plan your actions or think about anything. That could be useful for teenagers. I think it could be useful maybe for all of us.
Craig?
Don't you think we're all addicted to something? Everybody in this room has an addiction.
Here's the interesting question. There are things that I like to do a lot, right? But what I do not find myself doing is saying, you know, I'm not going to go to work today. I'm going to go, you know, stay home and play guitar all day. I value it a lot. There's no doubt about it. I put resources in it. I like to do it, but I don't do it in lieu of important goals and other obligations, right? And that's where we run into people that have addiction problems. They do it in lieu of their obligations.
Further questions? Right here, Annie's got one. Annie, let me pass this microphone to you because we need it. We're crowded, so let's just get the microphone to you.
If I followed your research and the relationship between poverty and the society that we are all a member of, what is the relationship of the land and the people as it relates to poverty? And I'm having reference to the geographical relationship of the Delta and the Appalachia geographical poverty. And if what your research is saying, a public policy to eradicate poverty, should that be the survival of our country?
Well, you know, I think that you know, there are clearly regions of our country that are endemic and have multi-generational poverty, and I think that what happens is that becomes its own unique culture, and the culture provides the you know, like that quote that I referred to, gives the solutions to the next generation from the older generation. This is how you do it. One of the saddest outcomes, I think, about our contemporary society is the fact that we segregate ourselves where we live on the basis of socioeconomic status. Why? Because no role models. No role models for kids or others who come from modest means to see how other people do it. If they are all segregated in certain geographical locations, they're just going to get one message from that community. What they need to see is the diversity. There's earlier in in the halfway point of the last century, you would go to, if you went into cities, you would be seeing a doctor living upstairs, people who own their own storefront, a whole diversity of different income individuals living together. You don't see that anymore now, do we? That has consequences too, and they're not good consequences. I know there's been some policy initiatives to try to reintegrate individuals who are very poor into more middle-income families or neighborhoods, and the results have been very encouraging and positive, and there's been some concern about whether that would import crime. The evidence is not there to support it. So I think we do have to fight poverty wherever it occurs. I think that we have to start thinking about really the way we do things in a big way. And actually, one of the greatest things that could happen, I think, to support that is to keep oil prices high, right? Because then people are going to start saying, well, maybe I got to live downtown. Well, if they live downtown, who are they going to live next to? They're going to live to some people from more modest means. So I think it's an opportunity, and I hope that comes to be the case.
Got time for one more question. We have one more question. Yeah, right over here. Yeah, she's bringing the mic, Hope.
Thank you. If I understood your graphs right, it looked like the very elderly have the least amount of future discounting, or in other words, they would take the future into account the most, which seems like a paradox since they would have the least amount of life left. And I just wondered, are the very elderly thinking about their individual futures, or have they reached a point where they can think about sort of a common future?
Well, so we have the data. It goes through age I think like 69 or just right before 70, and that's what the data says, that they're still forward thinking. And what is interesting to find out is how far that further extends. We're actually doing a study right now up at UAMS where we're looking at a very interesting phenomena that every time I even say the statistics, I shake my head because I don't understand. Somewhere between 40 and 60% of individuals who get a diagnosis of head and neck cancer and who smoke continue to smoke following the diagnosis of cancer. Holy mackerel. That's a severe form of addiction. So some of those people are clearly, facing their mortality, and maybe one way they're doing is by saying it doesn't matter. Well, we're going to actually measure how much those people consider the future, the ones who keep on smoking and the ones that quit smoking, and see whether that tells us an interesting story, and maybe would reflect a little bit on the theme as if you know the end is coming, do you start buying Haagen-Dazs?